You've been fed a colossal lie thanks to stiff Victorian historians and every gloomy medieval movie ever churned out. Hollywood and history textbooks shoved the myth that medieval serfs were powerless, mud-caked slaves with zero rights, doomed to slave for their lords until death. If you believe that, think again. Victorian giants like Charles Dickens and melodramatic 19th century epics are to blame for this sticky, false stereotype. Here's the real shocker: English legal records like the 11th century Domesday Book show serfs owning land, suing their lords, and negotiating contracts hardly the image of helpless victims. Archaeologists in the 1990s uncovered German villages where serfs decorated their homes, proving they had cash and pride. If you thought medieval peasants were just background NPCs stuck on eternal mud levels, congratulations, you've been conned by Victorian fan fiction, and it's as absurd as expecting knights to joust on motorcycles. While serfs were often seen as powerless slaves, the emergence of capitalism during the Renaissance marked a significant economic shift rather than an overnight replacement. You've been lied to blatantly. Hollywood and those outdated high school textbooks shove the myth that capitalism burst onto the scene overnight during the Renaissance. If you believe that, you might as well say TikTokers invented dancing. The real story is far older and far more chaotic. The classic fairy tale goes medieval Europe was pitch-black poverty, everyone trading goats for bread, then bam. Florence suddenly births banks, and boom, stock trading everywhere. Blame Victorian historians and their breathless documentary narrators for this cheap cinematic rewrite. They smashed centuries of brutal economic struggle into a single, cheesy Netflix montage. Here's the raw truth: medieval guilds were grinding from the 12th century onward. Merchant ledgers from Lubeck and 14th century Florentine wool contracts are undeniable proof Cambridge economic history of Europe. The Riccardi and Peruzzi families ran international credit empires in the late 13th century, complete with bills of exchange Michael 1000. Post on Medieval Economy and Society. Find the grain price charts etched in Bruges warehouses by 1990s archaeologists, and tell me those primitive traders weren't speculating like crypto bros on a caffeine binge. Face it, believing Renaissance Italy invented capitalism is like claiming Zuckerberg came up with friendship in his dorm room. If you still imagine bankers popping into existence with the Medici crest, congrats, you probably think your smartphone was hand-carved in a Roman temple. Despite the rise of capitalism, serfdom persisted across much of Europe, well beyond the Renaissance period. You've been sold a savage medieval prison fantasy, and Hollywood is the mastermind behind the scam. Thanks to blockbuster epics and Victorian historians obsessed with darkness, you probably picture every European peasant chained for life, wallowing in filth beneath a laughing tyrant. But that brutal image, pure Victorian propaganda then drenched in Oscar-worthy mud by films like Braveheart. Here's the hard truth: people love to insist that from the early Middle Ages through Shakespeare's era, all Europeans were miserable, unfree serfs. Those endless mud-slogging scenes? Straight from directors trapped in the 19th century gloom. Reality check: by the 14th century, serfdom in England was collapsing. The Domesday Book of the 11th century already lists countless free landowners, not just shackled peasants. Scandinavian legal codes like the Frostething Law, plus 12th century archaeological digs, prove these lands thrived with free farmers. Historian Tom Scott's The City-State in Europe exposes vibrant free peasantries stretching from Italy to Switzerland. If you swallowed the Hollywood mudfest, it's time to rethink medieval Europe wasn't a peasant survivor mud-ocalypse. It was far more complex and free than the fairy tales want you to believe. Although serfdom was widespread, innovation did not wait for its end, but gradually occurred during its decline. You've been fed a history cooked up by Victorian prudes, yeah. The bonnet and boredom brigade who claimed coal dust defined character. These self-righteous narrators pushed the lie that human innovation ignited only after serfdom died. Grab your imaginary pitchfork because it's time to shatter that myth. Here's the Hollywood lie you swallowed: serfdom chained human brilliance, condemning the Middle Ages to a dull, invention-free wasteland until freedom arrived. Thank the 19th century Victorian reformers, novelists, and armchair historians like Thomas Carlyle who twisted medieval history to glorify their factory-driven industrial age. But moldboard plows. Serfs were wielding those by the 6th century, revolutionizing European farming centuries before Victoria ever ruled. Archaeological digs in Poland and France, plus Walter of Henley's 13th century agrarian manual, confirm this. Windmills. 12th century serf innovations, recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. So if you bought the story that serfdom crushed creativity, congrats, you just fell for the industrial age's original fake news. And if you still believe progress kicked off only after serfdom, it'll sell you prime beachfront property in Mordor. The assertion that innovation began only after serfdom overlooks the fact that lords wielded substantial power that both constrained and sometimes encouraged change. You've been flat out lied to about medieval lords. Blame Hollywood and your high school textbooks. They sold you a fairy tale of ruthless tyrants and helpless peasants as fake as a castle built from cardboard. If you believed lords ruled like cartoon villains, handing out punishments, raising rents, and evicting families on a whim, you fell for a Victorian dramatized myth amplified by hacky films that turned the Middle Ages into a never-ending Game of Thrones. But the cold, hard evidence. Manorial court rolls from 13th century England prove lords were constantly checked by village juries, local customs, and even royal law. The customals of the Manor of Wakefield from the late 13th century clearly state lords couldn't just randomly evict tenants or jack up rents. Far from timid, angry peasants sued, protested, and even fined their landlords if they crossed the line. Archaeology confirms stable family plots, not landlord free-for-alls. If you thought your modern landlord was bad, guess what? Medieval serfs had the power to fine overreaching lords. Your king of the fief fantasy just got audited by a jury of farmers. Surprised. Next, you'll tell me dragons didn't terrorize villages. While lords held significant authority, the notion that serfs were perpetually bound to their villages oversimplifies complex social dynamics. You've been royally lied to about medieval peasants, and it's all the Victorians' twisted fantasy. Those top-hatted moralists slapped on the image of serfs as miserable, shackled zombies, doomed to slog through mud until death. But actual 14th century evidence laughs in their snobby faces. If you bought the Hollywood scam of sweaty villagers groveling endlessly, think again. Judging by manorial court rolls and taxation records from medieval England, shout out to Judith Bennett's deep dive into Lincolnshire serfs, were anything but stagnant. They hustled to distant fairs, landed seasonal gigs, or jumped manors like medieval freelancers. Market days weren't boring veggie swaps. They were networking gold mines, reunions, and job hunts packed into one. And that cliché, buy your freedom plot. Straight out of 12th century charters, many actually banked their way out. So if you saw serfs as medieval NPCs, guess what? Victorian novelists totally medieval catfished you. In fact, serfs had more travel freedom than your 21st century rush hour nightmare. As some serfs remained tied to their local communities, early capitalists began to emerge with varying motivations, not simply as caricatures of greed. You've been fed a Hollywood fairy tale and cynical anti-capitalist propaganda disguised as history. Every time you imagine a medieval merchant, you're picturing Scrooge McDuck in a velvet doublet, thanks to Dickens, bitter Victorian moralists, and every anti-business blockbuster ever made. Here's the brutal truth. The myth that early capitalists were ruthless pirates burning down tradition in a gold rush is pure fiction. Sound familiar? That's straight out of Charles Dickens' 19th century novel Hard Times, or any mustache-twirling villain tying virtue to railroad tracks in campy old movies. Open the 14th century ordinances of London's Mercer's Company, and you'll find fines for price gouging and mandates to help struggling colleagues. Flip to 15th century Florence, where Francesco d'Attinis letters reveal a merchant more concerned with fairness and spiritual karma than cutthroat greed. Over in Bruges, merchant guilds imposed strict price controls to protect the entire community. If you believed medieval merchants were the original Bitcoin bros hustling scams, congratulations, Hollywood has successfully put you on its payroll. Sorry, Shark Tank, but these guys' idea of a hostile takeover was making sure a widow didn't freeze in winter. Contrary to the belief that early capitalists destroyed old ways for profit, Monetary transactions were already evolving long before capitalism took hold. You've been sold a con by Victorian economists that before Big 100 capitalism rescued us, everyone awkwardly swapped sheep for shoes like clueless savages. If you believe this fairy tale, prepare to have your monopoly money flipped. History was loaded with real cash far earlier than you think. Hollywood and dusty textbooks push the myth that the old world survived on pure barter wheat for wine, cows for cloaks until banks strutted in with coin and credit. That lie. Spawned by 19th century armchair, historians desperate to crown banks as inventors of money. Reality check: 12th century London wasn't just mud and goat trades. Archaeologists keep unearthing hordes of silver pennies, literal medieval loose change, proving your average baker accepted coins, not clunky livestock. Then there are the English pipe rolls from the 12th century receipts, tally sticks, even IOUs. Peasants with paperwork. You bet. By the 14th century, Venetian merchants had bills of exchange. They were the Venmo app of their time. If you pictured medieval markets as barter kings, congrats, you've swallowed Dickens and Disney's spin, hook, line, and sinker. Medieval folks slammed cash and credit centuries before Wall Street was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Trust me, their finance game was stronger than buying Bitcoin with monopoly money today. Despite the presence of money and trade, social mobility remained limited for many peasants compared to emerging capitalist classes. Hollywood lied medieval peasants were not chained to the mud while rich city folk cruised their way up. If you believe that Victorian novels and snoozy Edwardian historians, plus early Hollywood epics, nailed the truth, think again. This frozen and cast myth. It's classist nostalgia dressed as history, popularized by Charles Dickens and his fans. Let's shatter this myth right now. 14th century England's manorial rolls from Warham Percy prove peasants constantly bought, inherited, and battled over land. French tax records from the 13th and 14th centuries expose peasants bolting to booming towns. Check the flight from the land. And the mobile merchant class. The mighty Medici dynasty went bankrupt in the late 16th century, wiping themselves out. If you believed peasants were trapped because that's how society worked, congrats, you've swallowed Downton Abbey's plot with extra mud and fewer bathrooms. The struggles faced by peasants contrast with extreme claims about capitalist landlords resorting to torture purely for profit. You've been sold a nightmare stitched by Victorian moralizers and Hollywood liars, the evil capitalist landlord, twirling a devilish mustache, tormenting peasants just to squeeze another silver coin. But what if those spine-chilling tales are mostly sensational fiction? More penny dreadful than fact. If you believed medieval and early modern landlords were cartoon villains obsessed with peasant misery, think again. Blame Victorian reformers, melodramatic 19th century penny novels, and of course, Hollywood's eager love for demonizing landlords to fuel cheap drama. Open rent rolls from 15th century English manors. See Mark Bailey's groundbreaking study, The English Manor, 100, 1200, 100, 1500, and you'll find practicality, not cruelty. Landlords offered deferred payments, crop-sharing deals, and even community arbitration. The horror stories of sadistic punishment, pulled straight from moralizing sermons, not estate ledgers. Excavations at Warham Percy in the 1990s reveal peasants living in stable, multi-generational homes, not burning ruins. Absurdly, some of your favorite blood-curdling landlord legends actually began as 19th century socialist pamphlets mimicking Gothic fiction. If you ever thought signing a lease was medieval torture, congratulations, Hollywood just punked you. Real torture. Wading through bad history, not paying medieval rent. It's like believing the landlord is a fire-breathing dragon when he's just your accountant with a weird tie. While stories of exploitation abound, medieval towns played a more significant and dynamic role than often credited in pre-capitalist economies. Victorian historians and modern capitalism have sold you a blatant fairy tale. Pre-capitalist towns were not just muddy, backward hives stuck in the so-called Dark Ages. Hollywood montages and outdated textbooks have deliberately portrayed medieval cities as stagnant, irrelevant backwaters. If you believed those lies, you've bought into the most tired stereotype medieval towns as glorified villages with a handful of peasants and a lone goat for excitement. Blame the 19th century Victorians and their industrial swagger. They systematically downplayed medieval urban life to make their glossy capitalism look like a groundbreaking revolution. Here's the bombshell by the 13th century. Cities like Lübeck weren't just towns, they ruled themselves. Open any Hanseatic city charter from the late Middle Ages and see the proof. Bruges in the 14th century. It was an international trade powerhouse, pulling goods from all over Europe, as the Bruges Freemen documents vividly show. Excavations in the 1990s in Lübeck revealed sprawling urban infrastructure that would make your modern suburb look like a country village. If you still think pre-capitalist towns were dull, you're probably imagining a Renaissance fair right after closing time. Buying this myth means handing credit for urban civilization over to coal barges and Victorian top hats. Talk about rewriting history backwards. Despite towns' importance, serfs often had restricted rights regarding property and decision-making in rural areas. You've been sold a medieval sob story, spoon-fed by Victorian historians and Hollywood's lazy backlot scribes. They want you to see serfs as nothing more than human furniture, voiceless, propertyless, barely worth the dirt on a noble's boot. But here's the punch: real medieval peasants lived lives far less miserable and drone-like than your high school textbook or your go-to-sword and shield epic ever dared admit. The myth. Serfs owned nothing, made zero decisions, and existed as their lord's livestock with thumbs. This lie was hammered home by Victorian reformers and early 20th century chroniclers pushing their own civilizing agenda. Add in Braveheart's tears and mud peasants and suddenly, suffering was the brand. But check this: surviving wills and dowry contracts from late 13th and 14th century England prove serfs passed down livestock and tools 1000. Kowaleski, Economic History Review, 1988. Excavations at Warham Percy in the 1990s unearthed everyday goods, not shackles. If you believed serfs had less say than your auto vacuum, think again. Many wielded more property rights than your modern Alexa listening in. What's next? Expecting Siri to fetch dinner? Although serfs lacked personal property, international trade existed in various forms well before the rise of capitalism. Hollywood lied. International trade is not some genius capitalist invention. If you believed modern business textbooks and smug economists who jump from Adam Smith straight to Amazon, you've swallowed a fairy tale far duller than what medieval merchants actually pulled off. Think trade exploded out of Enlightenment brains, like powdered wigs churning out spreadsheets overnight. Blame 19th century Victorian historians and lazy travel docs that treat pre-modern markets like accidental pepper spills, no contracts, no strategy, just chaos. Here's the brutal truth. Hanseatic League ledgers from the 13th century thanks to Rep. Cow's detailed 19th century publication. Map trade deals from London to Novgorod with more precision than your fancy bank app. Frederick Lane's deep dive into Venetian shipping logs reveals 14th century Venice running trade with Amazon-level efficiency and cutthroat tactics. We even have 12th century England-Genoa trade treaties proving these deals weren't backyard garage sales. So if you think Wall Street invented shipping, you probably believe Wi-Fi was invented by Neanderthals banging sticks together. Ready to cancel your Hanseatic League membership yet? Alongside early trade networks, credit systems began developing prior to the establishment of modern banks. You've been lied to by every economics textbook and Hollywood blockbuster credit cards, and banks didn't invent lending or running a tab. Modern capitalism's hype machine erased a medieval hack that would make Visa execs sweat. The myth you swallowed. Only today's glass tower banks created credit. Hollywood loves painting bankers in pinstripes as greedy villains, but conveniently skips the 12th century, when people used tally sticks, actual carved wood, as IOUs. Victorian historians, obsessed with steam engines, dismissed medieval money magic as primitive, ignoring centuries of detailed ledger-keeping and wild borrowing. Tally sticks became so widespread, King Henry I made them the law of the land in 12th century England, and you can still see surviving examples in the British Museum. Archaeologists in the 1990s uncovered stockpiles of these sticks, proving debt was everyone's game long before Wall Street existed. So if you believed credit started with banks, think again. Your tab is just medieval Venmo for peasants. And yeah, that's way cooler than your plastic card. While credit institutions evolved, evaluating serfdom solely as always bad omits the nuances of its historical context. You've been hoodwinked by a black-and-white fairy tale about freedom, spun by Victorian historians, yes, Dickens cosplayers, calling you out. They painted serfdom as a brutal prison and made capitalism look like a happy ending. Just erase the soot, the child labor, and the misery. Right? If you believed medieval serfs were muddy, starving slaves liberated by the miracle of wages and factories, thank 19th century historian Thomas Macaulay and his cronies. They rewrote history to trash the Middle Ages and glorify the Industrial Revolution, while Hollywood endlessly recycled the pitiful peasant cliché. But check out English manorial rolls from the 14th century, and you'll find peasants with grazing rights, strong community ties, and less than half their year spent laboring for their lord. Now compare that to the cheerful early factory jobs. 1833 factory inspector reports reveal orphaned children choking on cotton dust for 16 brutal hours a day. No community, no support, just pure exhaustion. Still think medieval villages were hell on earth? Try enduring a Victorian mill, at least in the village. You had your sheep. It's like believing factory smoke was just fresh air and coal dust a spa treatment. Similarly, peasants possessed varying degrees of market awareness, challenging the idea that they were entirely ignorant until capitalism emerged. You've been brutally gaslit by Victorian historians and smug armchair economists. The myth that medieval peasants were clueless about money is pure propaganda. Hollywood lied. These ignorant serfs were shrewd dealmakers, the original bargain hunters centuries before Black Friday existed. If you believed peasants were brainless farmers blind to market prices, you fell for Victorian writers desperate to justify capitalism and lazy Hollywood stereotypes, with all those grimy faces and vacant stares plastered on every peasant. But 15th century English manorial records prove otherwise. Rural price lists for cheese, roofing, and more were literally cited by peasants during negotiations. Jane Whittle, The English Peasantry and the Economy, 1450 to 1550. 14th century French serf contracts included sharp escape clauses for bad harvests, meaning peasants weren't just haggling. They were drafting legal loopholes centuries before modern lawyers. Annalise E.S. 100, 1973. Polish digs from the 1990s uncovered scales and massive coin hoards hidden in thatched cottages. These peasants counted every penny like secret economic ninjas. If you think peasants just bartered eggs and grabbed whatever came their way, congrats, you've been binging Robin Hood reruns, not reading actual history. Your last Craigslist negotiation. A medieval serf would have crushed you like a GameStop short squeeze.